The Overlooked Security Guard, Part 1, Thomas Tom. Mitchell walked through the empty halls of Riverside Community College every night at exactly 11:30 p.m. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors as he checked each classroom door, ensuring they were properly locked. At 62 years old, Tom had been working the night security shift for almost 8 years, and most people barely noticed him. Students hurrying to late evening classes would pass by him without a second glance. Faculty members rushing to their cars after long days of teaching might nod politely, but they never stopped to chat. To them, Tom was just part of the background, another fixture in the building, like the water fountains or the bulletin boards covered in colorful announcements. Tom didn't mind being invisible. He actually preferred it that way. It meant he could do his job without interference, keeping the campus safe while everyone else went about their busy lives. But what none of them knew was that Tom carried with him a lifetime of experiences that would have amazed them. Every morning after his shift ended at 6 a.m., Tom would drive his old blue pickup truck to the small apartment he shared with his wife, Maria. She would have coffee waiting for him, along with breakfast and stories about her work at the local nursing home. Maria was one of the few people who truly knew Tom's history, though even she didn't know all the details. Tom had served 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sergeant. He had led men through impossible situations, saved lives under enemy fire, and earned medals that he kept hidden away in a shoebox in his bedroom closet. After the war, he had worked various jobs: construction, factory work, and eventually security. He never talked about his military service, not because he was ashamed, but because he believed that chapter of his life was over. The college campus felt peaceful to Tom during those quiet night hours. He would walk past the library where students had spent long hours studying, past the cafeteria where friends had shared meals and laughter, and past the administrative offices where important decisions about young people's futures were made daily. Sometimes he would find a door left unlocked or a window that hadn't been properly secured, and he would take care of it without fanfare. On Tuesday nights, Tom would always stop by the Veterans Support Office, even though it was closed. The small room on the second floor of the Student Services building housed resources for the handful of veteran students who attended the college. Tom would peer through the window at the pamphlets about benefits and support groups, the small American flag on the desk, and the photos of local veterans on the wall. His own military service had ended decades ago, but he still felt a connection to these younger men and women who were trying to rebuild their lives after their own tours of duty. Dr. Sarah Williams, the psychology professor who ran the Veterans Support Group, had tried several times to engage Tom in conversation. She had noticed him looking at the office and sensed something familiar in his bearing, but Tom would just smile politely and continue on his rounds. He wasn't ready to open old doors, and he certainly wasn't looking for sympathy or recognition. The maintenance staff knew Tom better than most people on campus. They would arrive early in the morning just as Tom was finishing his rounds, and they appreciated how he kept detailed notes about anything that needed attention. A broken light in the math building, a leak in the women's restroom on the 3rd floor, or a heating unit that wasn't working properly. Tom documented everything carefully and left notes for the day crew. James Rodriguez, the head of maintenance, had worked with Tom for 6 years and respected his thoroughness. "That man sees everything," James would tell his crew. "If Tom says something needs fixing, you better believe it needs fixing." But even James didn't know about Tom's background. Their conversations stayed focused on work, which areas needed extra attention, which systems were aging and might cause problems, and how to keep the building running smoothly. Students who attended evening classes sometimes saw Tom making his rounds, but he seemed almost ghost-like to them. He moved quietly, efficiently, never drawing attention to himself. Some of the younger students found him intimidating. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. But if they had taken the time to really look, they might have noticed the kindness in those eyes, or the way Tom always made sure to check the parking lots extra carefully. When he knew students were working late in the computer labs, Tom's routine never varied much. He would start his shift by checking all the exterior doors and windows on the ground floor, then work his way up through each level of every building. He carried a small flashlight and a ring of keys that jingled softly as he walked. His uniform was always clean and pressed, his shoes polished, and his security badge worn with quiet pride in the faculty lounge. Professors would sometimes discuss campus security during their brief encounters. They felt safe knowing someone was watching over the building at night, but they never thought much about who that someone was or what his story might be. Tom was just the night security guard, a reassuring presence, who kept their workplace secure while they slept safely in their homes. What they couldn't have imagined was that the man walking those halls had once carried wounded Marines to safety under heavy enemy fire in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They didn't know that he had earned a Bronze Star for valor, or that he still woke up sometimes at night thinking about the friends he had lost in a war that seemed like a lifetime ago. Tom kept his past locked away, just like he locked the classroom doors each night. Some things, he believed, were better left undisturbed. He was content to be overlooked, to do his job well, and to go home to Maria each morning knowing that he had kept another small corner of the world safe for one more night. The Overlooked Security Guard, Part 2. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, just as Tom was finishing his final security check of the campus. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket while he was locking up the main entrance to the administration building. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer it anyway. "Is this Thomas Mitchell?" the voice on the other end asked. It was a woman, and she sounded official. "Yes, this is Tom," he replied, stepping outside into the cool morning air. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Linda Chun from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm calling because we've been trying to locate you regarding some military records that have recently been declassified." Tom felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't had contact with the VA in years, not since he'd briefly looked into benefits after Maria had her surgery. "What kind of records?" he asked, walking slowly toward his truck. "Sir, it appears that some of your service records from Vietnam were incomplete in our system. We've recently received additional documentation about your unit's actions in 1969, and there are some commendations that were never properly processed." Tom leaned against his truck, suddenly feeling very tired. "Ma'am, I appreciate you calling, but that was a long time ago. I'm not looking for any recognition or benefits from that time. Mr. Mitchell, I understand this might be unexpected, but some of these records indicate actions that deserve formal recognition. There's also information about Purple Heart eligibility that was never properly reviewed." Tom had been wounded twice in Vietnam, once by shrapnel from a mortar attack, and once when he had been shot while pulling a fellow Marine to safety. But the field medical treatment had been so basic that proper documentation had never been completed. In those days, if you could walk, you went back to fighting. Paperwork wasn't a priority. "I really don't need any medals," Tom said quietly. "I did what anyone would have done." "Sir, with respect, not everyone would have done what you did. Your commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, submitted several recommendations for commendations that somehow never made it through the system. We found his original reports, and they paint a picture of extraordinary service." After the phone call ended, Tom sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine. He had spent 40 years trying not to think about Vietnam, about the young Marines he had led, about the impossible decisions he had been forced to make. He had built a quiet life with Maria, found peace in his simple routines, and learned to sleep through most nights without nightmares. When he got home, Maria was waiting with coffee and her usual warm smile. She could see immediately that something was troubling him. "The VA called," he said simply. Settling into his favorite chair at their small kitchen table, Maria had been married to Tom for 38 years. She knew when to push for more information and when to wait for him to work through things on his own. She poured his coffee and sat across from him, her hands folded patiently in her lap. "They want to give me some medals," Tom continued after a few minutes. "Said they found records that never got processed properly. And how do you feel about that?" Maria asked gently. Tom stared out the window at their small garden, where Maria had planted tomatoes and peppers that were just beginning to show new growth. I feel like it's too late, he said. The boys who deserved recognition didn't make it home. I did. That's recognition enough. But over the next few weeks, the VA continued to contact Tom. Linda Chun was persistent but respectful, explaining that the military wanted to correct historical oversights and properly honor service members whose actions had been documented but not formally recognized. She sent copies of the original reports written by Tom's commanding officers, documents that detailed specific incidents of heroism that Tom had tried to forget. Reading those reports was like opening a door he had sealed shut decades ago. The clinical military language couldn't capture the chaos and terror of those moments, but it brought back vivid memories of young faces, the smell of gunpowder and jungle rot, and the weight of responsibility he had carried as a sergeant leading Marines who were barely out of high school. One report described an incident when Tom's unit had been pinned down by enemy fire for over 6 hours. Tom had crawled through hostile territory 3 separate times to retrieve wounded Marines, carrying them back to relative safety while under constant fire. He had been wounded during the 3rd rescue but had refused evacuation until all his men were accounted for. Another report detailed how Tom had single-handedly held a defensive position for 2 hours after the rest of his squad had been forced to retreat. He had allowed 37 Marines to safely withdraw while he provided covering fire with limited ammunition and no backup. When reinforcements finally reached his position, they found Tom unconscious from blood loss but still at his post. Maria found him reading these reports one evening when she came home from work. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of him, tears running down his weathered cheeks. I had forgotten how young they all were, he whispered. Some of them were 19, 20 years old. They trusted me to bring them home, and I couldn't save them all. Maria sat beside him and took his hand. She had always known that Tom carried deep wounds from his time in Vietnam, but he had never shared the specific details. You saved the ones you could? She said softly. That's what heroes do. I'm not a hero, Tom replied, the same thing he had said countless times over the years. I was just doing my job. But as the weeks passed and more information came to light, Tom began to understand that his story was part of something larger. The VA wasn't just trying to give him medals, they were working to correct a systematic failure to properly recognize the service of thousands of Vietnam veterans whose actions had been documented but never formally honored. Linda Chun explained that Tom's case had been brought to their attention because a historian researching Vietnam War battles had found discrepancies between field reports and official commendation records. Tom's commanding officers had written glowing reports about his actions, but those reports had somehow been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle that often characterized military record-keeping during wartime. Your story matters, Mr. Mitchell, Linda had said during one of their phone calls. Not just for you, but for your family and for the other Marines who served with you. History should remember what you did. Tom still wasn't convinced that he wanted public recognition, but he was beginning to understand that accepting these honors might be about more than just him. It might be about honoring the memory of the young Marines who hadn't made it home, and acknowledging the sacrifices made by all the men who had served under his leadership, the quiet security guard who had walked the halls of Riverside Community College for 8 years was slowly being forced to confront the decorated Marine sergeant he had once been. And though he didn't know it yet, that confrontation would lead to revelations that would surprise everyone who thought they knew Tom Mitchell. The overlooked security guard, Part 3DR, Sarah Williams, noticed something different about Tom Mitchell during one of her late evening visits to her office. She had been working on lesson plans for her psychology classes when she saw Tom making his usual rounds, but tonight he seemed distracted. Instead of his normal brisk, efficient pace, he was moving slowly, almost hesitantly. For months, Dr. Williams had been curious about Tom, as someone who worked extensively with veterans. She had developed an instinct for recognizing military bearing, even in people who tried to hide it. Tom's posture, the way he scanned his surroundings, and his methodical approach to his work all suggested military experience. But he had always deflected her attempts at conversation. Tonight was different. When Tom stopped outside the Veterans Support Office, he didn't just glance through the window as usual. He stood there for several minutes, his hand resting on the doorframe. Lost in thought, Dr. Williams stepped into the hallway. "Good evening, Tom," she said gently. "Everything all right?" Tom startled slightly, as if he had forgotten where he was. "Oh, Dr. Williams, sorry, I didn't realize you were working so late." "No problem at all. I was just finishing up some grading." She moved closer, noting the tension in his shoulders and the distant look in his eyes. "You seem like you have something on your mind tonight." For a moment, Tom looked like he might walk away as he always did. But then he surprised her. "Dr. Williams, can I ask you something? How do you help the veterans in your group deal with things they did a long time ago?" The question was so unexpected that Dr. Williams had to think before responding. "Well, that depends on what kinds of things they're struggling with. But generally, I try to help them understand that they can't change the past, only how they choose to respond to it in the present." Tom nodded slowly. "What if they did things they're proud of, but they lost people along the way? Good people who deserved better than what happened to them?" Dr. Williams recognized survivor's guilt immediately. She had worked with enough veterans to know the signs. "Survivor's guilt is one of the most common struggles our veterans face," she said carefully. "Many of them feel guilty for coming home when their friends didn't. But Tom, surviving doesn't make someone responsible for others' deaths. How do you know if someone is worthy of recognition when better people didn't get the same chance?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we talking about someone specific?" Dr. Williams asked, though she suspected they were talking about Tom himself. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost without meaning to, the words started coming out. He told her about the VA calling, about the military records that had been found, about the medals they wanted to give him for actions he had taken 50 years ago. He talked about the young Marines he had served with, their faces still clear in his memory, and how it didn't seem fair that he should be honored when they couldn't be. Dr. Williams listened without interrupting, understanding that this might be the first time Tom had talked about these experiences with anyone other than his wife. When he finished, they stood in silence for a few minutes. "Tom," she finally said, "can I tell you about one of my students? His name is Marcus, and he served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He came to me last year convinced that he didn't deserve to be alive because his best friend died in an IED explosion while Marcus was on leave." Tom looked at her with interest. Marcus thought that accepting any recognition for his service was somehow betraying his friend's memory. But through our work together, he came to understand that honoring his own service was actually a way of honoring his friend's service too. They served together, they supported each other, and Marcus came home carrying not just his own story, but part of his friend's story too. "I never thought about it that way," Tom admitted. "The question isn't whether you deserve recognition more than the Marines who didn't come home," Dr. Williams continued. "The question is whether you're willing to accept recognition on behalf of all of them, to let your story represent their stories too." That conversation marked a turning point for Tom over the next few weeks. He found himself thinking differently about the medals and ceremonies the VA was proposing. Maybe it wasn't about him personally. Maybe it was about ensuring that the sacrifices made by his entire unit weren't forgotten. Meanwhile, word about Tom's military background had begun to spread quietly around the campus. Dr. Williams, with Tom's permission, had mentioned to a few colleagues that their night security guard was a decorated Vietnam veteran. The reaction was immediate and profound. Professor David Chun, who taught history, was particularly interested. His own father had served in Vietnam, and he had spent years studying that conflict. When he learned that Tom had served with distinction in some of the war's most difficult battles, he approached Tom with genuine respect and curiosity. "I teach about the Vietnam War," Professor Chun told Tom one evening, "but I've never had the chance to talk with someone who was actually there, who led Marines in combat." Would you ever consider speaking to my class? The idea terrified Tom, standing in front of a room full of students. Talking about experiences he had kept private for decades seemed impossible. But Professor Chun was persistent and respectful, explaining how valuable it would be for his students to hear first-hand accounts of historical events. You don't have to talk about anything you're not comfortable with, Professor Chun assured him. But these young people need to understand that history isn't just dates and battle names. It's about real people making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. James Rodriguez from the maintenance department had overheard one of these conversations, and he was shocked to learn about Tom's background. James was the son of a Vietnam veteran himself, and he had grown up hearing stories about that war. To think that Tom had been walking these halls for 8 years, carrying such a significant military history, amazed him. Why didn't you ever mention this? James asked Tom during one of their morning conversations. It wasn't relevant to the job, Tom replied simply. Not relevant. Tom, you're a war hero. You saved people's lives. That's pretty relevant to everything. But Tom still struggled with the term hero. In his mind, heroes were the Marines who hadn't made it home, or the ones who had charged into enemy fire without hesitation. He was just someone who had done what needed to be done and had been lucky enough to survive. The campus community was beginning to see Tom differently. Students who had barely noticed him before now looked at him with curiosity and respect. Faculty members who had nodded politely in the past now stopped to ask him about his experiences. The invisible security guard was becoming visible, and it made Tom uncomfortable, but there was something else happening too. The attention was forcing Tom to confront parts of his past that he had kept buried. Talking with Dr. Williams had opened a door, and now memories were flowing back, not just the painful ones, but also memories of camaraderie, of young men supporting each other through impossible situations, of moments when his leadership had made the difference between life and death for his Marines. For the first time in decades, Tom began to consider that maybe his story was worth telling. Not because he was special, but because the Marines who had served with him deserved to have their stories told too. And if accepting recognition for his actions could help tell those stories, maybe it was worth stepping out of the shadows he had hidden in for so long. The Overlook Security Guard, Part 4. The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late April. Tom had finally agreed to accept the medals that the Department of Veterans Affairs wanted to present to him, though he insisted on a small private ceremony. He didn't want any fanfare or media attention, just a simple recognition ceremony in the college's main conference room with Maria, Dr. Williams, and a few of his co-workers present. Linda Shun from the VA had traveled from Sacramento to personally present the awards. She arrived early that morning with a formal presentation case containing a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with V for Valor, and a Combat Action Ribbon, honors that should have been awarded decades earlier but had been lost in bureaucratic confusion. Tom had taken the day off from work, which was unusual for him. In 8 years at the college, he had rarely called in sick and had never taken time off for personal reasons. Maria had pressed his best shirt and helped him choose a tie for the occasion. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since his wedding day. "You look handsome," Maria told him as they prepared to leave for the ceremony. "Those Marines you served with would be proud to see you today." The conference room had been decorated simply with an American flag and some flowers that Dr. Williams had arranged. About 20 people were present, more than Tom had expected. In addition to the college staff he had requested, several students had asked to attend after hearing about the ceremony through Professor Chun. Among the attendees was Marcus Rodriguez, the Afghanistan veteran who was in Dr. Williams' support group. When Tom had learned that Marcus wanted to be there, he had been touched. The young man reminded him of the Marines he had served with. Serious, dedicated, and carrying invisible wounds from his service, Linda Chun began the ceremony by reading excerpts from the military reports that had led to Tom's belated recognition. As she described his actions during several key battles, Tom felt uncomfortable with the attention but proud of the Marines who had served alongside him. She spoke about the incident where Tom had held a defensive position alone for 2 hours, allowing his unit to safely withdraw, and about the multiple times he had risked his life to rescue wounded Marines. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell exemplified the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps, Linda read from his commanding officer's original report. His selfless actions under enemy fire saved the lives of at least 12 Marines and demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. As Linda presented each medal, she explained its significance. The Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, the Bronze Star for heroic achievement in a combat zone, and the Combat Action Ribbon for actively engaging the enemy, Tom accepted. Each award quietly, thinking not about his own actions but about the young faces of the Marines, who hadn't received similar recognition because they hadn't made it home. Professor Chun had asked if he could say a few words during the ceremony. He spoke about the importance of recognizing service and sacrifice, and about how honored the college community felt to have Tom working among them. For 8 years we've had a genuine American hero walking our halls, keeping us safe, and we never knew it, he said. Tom's humility and dedication to service didn't end when he left the Marines. It continued in every shift he worked, every door he checked, every time he made sure our campus was secure. Dr. Williams also spoke, talking about the privilege of getting to know Tom over recent months and about the wisdom he had shared with her veteran support group. Several students had asked if they could attend the ceremony, and their presence meant more to Tom than he had expected after the formal presentation. People stayed to talk and share refreshments. Tom was surprised by how many colleagues approached him with stories about their own family members who had served in Vietnam. James Rodriguez talked about his father's service and how much it meant to him to work alongside another Vietnam veteran. Several faculty members shared that they had relatives who had served in that war, and they thanked Tom for his service in a way that felt genuine and meaningful. But the moment that affected Tom most deeply came when Marcus Rodriguez approached him after the ceremony. The young Marine veteran had been quiet during the presentations, but now he asked if he could speak with Tom privately. "Sergeant Mitchell," Marcus said, using Tom's military rank with obvious respect, "I wanted to thank you for accepting these awards. I've been struggling with survivor's guilt since I came home from Afghanistan. Dr. Williams has been helping me work through it. But seeing you today, seeing how you carried yourself during this ceremony, it helps me understand something important." "What's that?" Tom asked. "That accepting recognition for our service isn't about thinking we're better than the people who didn't come home. It's about honoring all of us, the ones who came back and the ones who didn't. When you accepted those medals today, you were accepting them for all the Marines in your unit, not just yourself." Tom nodded, feeling a tightness in his throat. "Those Marines deserve to be remembered," he said quietly. "If these medals help people remember them, then I'm proud to wear them." The conversation with Marcus helped Tom understand something that Dr. Williams had been trying to tell him for weeks. His willingness to accept recognition wasn't about ego or personal glory. It was about ensuring that the sacrifices made by his entire unit, including those who hadn't survived, wouldn't be forgotten. After everyone had left and Tom and Maria were driving home, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of peace about his military service. For 50 years he had carried guilt about surviving when others hadn't, about the decisions he had made under extreme pressure, about whether he had done enough to protect the young Marines under his command. "How do you feel?" Maria asked as they pulled into their driveway. "Different," Tom said after thinking for a moment. "Like maybe it's okay to be proud of what we did over there. Not proud of the war itself, but proud of how we took care of each other." That weekend, Tom did something he hadn't done since returning from Vietnam. He took the medals out of their presentation case and really looked at them. The Purple Heart, with its distinctive purple ribbon and profile of George Washington. The Bronze Star with its bronze finish and red, white, and blue ribbon. The Combat Action Ribbon with its simple but meaningful design. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to feel proud of these symbols. Not because they made him special, but because they represented the service and sacrifice of all the Marines he had served with. He thought about Danny Rodriguez, who had been killed by a sniper just 2 days before his 20th birthday. About Mike Thompson, who had died pulling Tom to safety after Tom had been shot. About all the young men who had trusted his leadership and who deserved to be remembered as heroes. Tom decided to display the medals on the dresser in his bedroom, where he would see them every morning when he got dressed for work. They would remind him not of his own actions, but of the Marines who had served alongside him and who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. The quiet security guard who had walked the halls of Riverside Community College for 8 years was finally ready to acknowledge the decorated Marine sergeant he had once been. And though he didn't know it yet, this acceptance would lead to connections and recognition that would surprise everyone who thought they knew Tom Mitchell's story. The Overlooked Security Guard, Part 5. 3 months after the medal ceremony, Tom's health began to decline rapidly. It started with a persistent cough that he dismissed as nothing serious. Maria urged him to see a doctor, but Tom was stubborn about medical care. He had always been healthy and strong, and he couldn't imagine that anything was seriously wrong. By June, the cough had worsened, and Tom was experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath. When he finally agreed to see a doctor, the news was devastating. Advanced lung cancer, likely caused by exposure to Agent Orange during his service in Vietnam. The doctor estimated he had perhaps 6 months to live. Tom took the diagnosis with the same stoic acceptance he had shown throughout his life. He had survived 3 tours in Vietnam, raised a family, and worked hard for 40 years after coming home. If this was his time, he would face it with dignity. He continued working his security rounds at the college, though Maria and Dr. Williams both urged him to retire and focus on his health. Tom insisted that work gave his life structure and purpose. Besides, he said, the college needed him, and he wasn't about to abandon his post. Professor Chun noticed that Tom was moving more slowly during his rounds and seemed to tire easily. When he learned about Tom's diagnosis, he was heartbroken. Over the past few months, Tom had become a friend and mentor. He had even agreed to speak to Professor Chun's history class about his Vietnam experiences, sharing stories that had deeply moved the students. The entire campus community rallied around Tom when news of his illness spread. Students who had never spoken to him before stopped to thank him for his service and to tell him how much they appreciated his dedication to keeping the campus safe. Faculty members brought him homemade meals and offered to help with anything he needed. Dr. Williams arranged for Tom to speak with other veterans in her support group about facing serious illness. His perspective on mortality, shaped by his combat experiences, helped several younger veterans deal with their own struggles. Tom talked about learning to find meaning in service to others, about the importance of not fighting battles alone, and about finding peace with decisions made under impossible circumstances. Marcus Rodriguez had become particularly close to Tom over the months following the medal ceremony. The young Marine veteran visited Tom regularly, sometimes helping with household tasks that were becoming difficult for him. Their conversations about military service, survivor's guilt, and finding purpose after combat had helped Marcus tremendously in his own healing process. "You know, Sergeant," Marcus said during one of their visits, "you've done more for me these past few months than any counselor ever did. Just by showing me how to carry yourself with honor, how to be proud of service without being boastful about it." Tom was deeply moved by the relationships he had formed since accepting recognition for his military service. For decades, he had kept his past hidden, believing that his war experiences were irrelevant to his civilian life. But opening up about his service had connected him to a community of veterans and supporters who understood and valued what he had been through. As fall approached and Tom's condition worsened, he made a difficult decision to retire from his security position. His last night at the college was emotional for everyone who had come to know and respect him. The administration organized a small gathering in his honor, attended by students, faculty, and staff. During the gathering, Tom was presented with a plaque recognizing his 8 years of dedicated service to the college. But what moved him most were the personal stories people shared about how his presence had affected them. Students talked about feeling safer knowing he was watching over the campus. Faculty members described how his quiet professionalism and dedication had inspired them. Dr. Williams spoke about how his willingness to share his experiences had helped other veterans in ways that formal therapy sometimes couldn't. Tom taught us that heroism isn't always dramatic or visible, Dr. Williams said to the gathered group. Sometimes it's just showing up every day, doing your job well, and caring about the people around you. He's been protecting and serving this community for 8 years, just like he protected and served his Marines 50 years ago. Tom's replacement was a younger man named Robert Hayes, a recent police academy graduate who was eager to learn the job. Tom spent his final weeks training Robert, sharing not just the technical aspects of campus security, but also the philosophy that had guided his approach to the work. The job isn't just about locking doors and checking windows, Tom explained to Robert. It's about being a guardian for this place. These students are here to learn and grow, and the faculty are here to help them do that. Our job is to make sure they can focus on that without worrying about their safety. Tom also shared with Robert his special attention to the Veterans Support Office, explaining how important it was to keep an eye on the veteran students who sometimes struggled with the transition to civilian life. They've been through things that most people can't understand, Tom said. Sometimes just knowing that someone who's been there is watching out for them makes a difference. During his final weeks, Tom received visits from many of the people who had become important to him over the past few months. Linda Shin from the VA came to check on him and to update him on other Vietnam veterans who were receiving belated recognition for their service. Professor Chun brought students from his history class who wanted to thank Tom for sharing his stories with them. Most surprisingly, Tom received a visit from Colonel James Harrison, his former commanding officer from Vietnam, now in his 80s, and retired for many years. Colonel Harrison had learned about Tom's situation through VA channels and had driven 3 hours to pay his respects. Tom, the colonel said, gripping his former sergeant's hand firmly, I wrote those reports about your actions 50 years ago, and every word was true. But I want you to know that your service didn't end when you left the Marines. From what I've learned about your work at this college, about how you've helped other veterans, about the example you've set. You've continued to serve with honor every day since you came home. The conversation with his former commanding officer meant more to Tom than perhaps any other recognition he had received. To know that the officer who had led him through those difficult months in Vietnam still respected him and considered him a Marine worth honoring was deeply meaningful. As winter approached, Tom's condition continued to deteriorate, but his spirits remained strong. He had found peace with his military service, pride in his work at the college, and deep satisfaction in the relationships he had built during his final months. The quiet security guard who had spent 8 years walking empty hallways had discovered that his life had touched more people than he had ever imagined possible. The overlooked security guard, Part 6, Tom Mitchell, passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in February, with Maria holding his hand and sunlight streaming through the window of their small bedroom. His death was peaceful, the kind of ending that seemed fitting for a man who had spent his life serving others without seeking attention or glory. Maria expected a small funeral service. Tom had always been private, and even after his military recognition, he had maintained that he was just an ordinary man who had done his job. She planned for perhaps 30 or 40 people, family members, a few neighbors, his colleagues from the college, and maybe some of the veterans from Dr. Williams' support group. What she didn't expect was the phone call from Colonel Harrison 3 days before the funeral. Mrs. Mitchell, the retired Marine colonel, said, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to ask about the arrangements for Tom's service. Of course, Colonel. The service is Friday morning at Riverside Memorial Chapel. It's going to be small and simple, the way Tom would have wanted it. Ma'am, I need to tell you something. Word about Tom's passing has spread through Marine networks. There are Marines from his old unit, Marines who served in later conflicts, and active duty Marines who want to pay their respects. Would you be comfortable if some of them attended the service? Maria was touched but not surprised. Over the past year, She had seen how Tom's willingness to share his story had connected him to a community of Marines and veterans that extended far beyond their small town. "Of course they're welcome," she said. Tom would be honored. What Colonel Harrison didn't tell her was the full extent of what was being planned. Through informal Marine networks and social media, word about Tom's funeral had reached Marines across the country. His story, the decorated sergeant who had spent 50 years working quietly as a civilian, never seeking recognition, finally receiving his medals, and then dying from Agent Orange exposure, had resonated deeply within the Marine community. On Friday morning, Maria arrived at the chapel expecting to see familiar faces from the college and their neighborhood. Instead, she found a sight that took her breath away. The parking lot was filled with cars bearing Marine Corps bumper stickers, motorcycle clubs flying Marine flags, and uniformed Marines who had traveled from bases hundreds of miles away inside the chapel. Nearly 300 people had gathered to honor Tom Mitchell. The front rows were filled with his family and friends from the college: Dr. Williams, Professor Chung, Marcus Rodriguez, James from maintenance, and many students who had been touched by Tom's story. But behind them sat row after row of Marines, veterans from multiple conflicts, and their families. Colonel Harrison served as one of the speakers, sharing stories about Tom's service in Vietnam and reading excerpts from the original combat reports that had finally led to his recognition. He spoke about how Tom had embodied the Marine motto of Semper Fidelis, always faithful, not just during his military service but throughout his entire life. Dr. Williams spoke about Tom's impact on the college community and on the veterans in her support group. She shared how Tom had taught them about quiet dignity, about finding purpose in service to others, and about the importance of honoring the memory of those who didn't come home. Marcus Rodriguez, representing the younger generation of veterans, spoke about how Tom had mentored him and helped him find pride in his own military service. "Sergeant Mitchell taught me that being a Marine isn't something you used to be," Marcus said. "It's something you are for life. He showed me that service continues long after you take off the uniform." But the most moving moment came when Professor Chun shared a letter that had been found among Tom's personal effects. It was a letter Tom had written but never sent, addressed to the families of the Marines who had been killed under his command in Vietnam. In it, Tom had expressed his grief over their deaths, his pride in their service, and his promise to honor their memory for the rest of his life. Tom carried the memory of those young Marines with him every day for 50 years, Professor Chun said. His dedication to service, his commitment to protecting others, his quiet dignity, all of it was his way of honoring their sacrifice. He lived his entire life as a tribute to their memory. The funeral service concluded with full military honors. A color guard from the local Marine Reserve unit presented the colors, and a bugler played taps as Tom's flag-draped casket was carried to the hearse. But what happened next was unprecedented. As the hearse began its journey to the cemetery, a procession unlike anything the small town had ever seen began to form. 50 Marine motorcycles, their engines rumbling in perfect synchronization, flanked the hearse. Behind them came car after car filled with Marines, veterans, and their families. The procession stretched for nearly 2 miles. At the cemetery, the final honors continued. The Marine Honor Guard performed the flag-folding ceremony with precision and dignity, presenting the flag to Maria on behalf of a grateful nation. But then something unexpected happened. One by one, the Marines who had attended the service began to approach Tom's casket. Each one snapped to attention, rendered a sharp salute, and placed something on the casket: a challenge coin, a unit patch, or a small American flag. The process took nearly an hour, but no one seemed impatient. This was their way of saying goodbye to a Marine who had embodied everything they aspired to be. Among those paying their respects were 3 Marines who had served under Tom's command in Vietnam and had traveled across the country to attend his funeral. They had learned of his death through Colonel Harrison and had felt compelled to honor the sergeant who had saved their lives 50 years earlier. "He pulled me out of that rice paddy when I was wounded," said Robert Chun, now a retired teacher. "I've thought about him every day since 1969. "He was the best Marine I ever served with." The local newspaper, which had planned a small obituary, instead ran a front-page story about the funeral with photographs of the massive procession and the Marine honor ceremony. The story was picked up by regional and then national media, and soon Tom Mitchell's story was being shared across the country, but perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Riverside Community College itself. The administration decided to rename the main security office the Thomas Mitchell Memorial Security Office, and they installed a plaque sharing his story and his example of quiet service. Dr. Williams established a scholarship fund in Tom's name for veteran students, funded by donations that poured in from Marines and supporters who had read about his story. Maria was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and recognition. She had always known that Tom was a special man, but she had never imagined that his story would touch so many people. The hundreds of cards and letters she received from Marines, veterans, and their families all shared a common theme. Tom had represented the best of what it meant to be a Marine and an American. 6 months after the funeral, Maria received a visit from the current commandant of the Marine Corps. He had come personally to present her with a special commendation recognizing Tom's lifetime of service to his fellow Marines and to his community. The citation read, in part, "Sergeant Thomas Mitchell exemplified the highest ideals of the United States Marine Corps throughout his military service and his civilian life. His dedication to duty, his commitment to his fellow Marines, and his quiet dignity and service to others represent the finest traditions of our Corps." The overlooked security guard who had walked the halls of a small community college for 8 years, checking doors and keeping people safe, had become a symbol of honor and service for Marines across the nation. His funeral, attended by 50 Marines who had never met him but who recognized a brother in arms, proved that true service is never forgotten and that the bonds forged in military service extend far beyond rank, time, or circumstance. Tom Mitchell had lived his life believing he was ordinary, but his death revealed the extraordinary impact that one person's quiet dedication to service can have on countless others. The Marines who attended his funeral came not because he was famous or because his story had been publicized, but because he represented everything they hoped to be: faithful, honorable, and committed to something larger than themselves. In death, as in life, Tom had brought people together in service to a common cause. His legacy would live on in the Marines he had inspired, the veterans he had mentored, the students whose campus he had protected, and the community that had learned to see heroism not as something dramatic and obvious, but as something quiet, consistent, and deeply meaningful.